Hello, this is a video for the Master Gardener program of Tennessee. And my name is Tom Stebbins, and I'm the county agent here in Hamilton County, Tennessee. And the title of this video is basically diseases of plants, and try to do some things with diagnostics for master gardeners. Basically, how to identify diseases and how to diagnose the problem. So basically, this presentation is for the Master Gardener class, but it could be for anyone interested in plant diseases. I worked at the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Center some years ago, so that's where I got my background. And the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Center is still available for anybody. It's basically a place where county agents send samples, but anybody can use that service. And so they do plant disease identification, insect identification, plant, just what plant it is, nematode identification, which are tiny little microscopic worms that can get into plants, and fescue, endophyte assays, which are a fungus that can get into some grasses. This is an example of those fungi that can get into grasses, and basically it can get into fescue grass that can hurt animals that eat the grass. But here I am some years ago where I was working in that lab. This is a picture of Tennessee with what we call the Distance Diagnostic Service. And every county has the ability now to take a picture and send it to the lab, which can then hopefully diagnose the problem. I usually give this seminar somewhere around March, February, during St. Patrick's Day is during that period, and but there's a lot of history that goes hand in hand with with the Irish. Back in 1845 to 1860, there was a terrible potato famine, and it turned out to be a fungus, which later on became was identified as an algae, but I always thought of it as a fungus all these years. And basically, the Irish had this terrible disease that went through their potato crop, and so a lot of them, 1 million people died, and 2 million people migrated just because of the famine. They had to get out of there and maybe a better life in America. And so we still have many problems with plant diseases. Some of these problems are reduction of food supply and maybe a reduction in varieties, unsafe food supply, destruction of beautiful plants, economic losses to growers, and maybe even price increases to consumers. Diseases affect plants in a lot of ways. I kiddingly think this is David Letterman's top 10 problems that can go wrong with plants. You can basically have a disease in just about any part of the plant, in any plant you could talk about. In the roots for water and nutrient uptake, or stems, the same thing. And leaves, little spots on the leaves can reduce photosynthesis. And fruit, definitely, if you get a rotted fruit, that'll be a problem. And here's just a typical non-generic. This could be an apple tree or a tomato plant or a rose plant, but basically this is one very sick plant, but it shows that you can have a lot of different things: leaf spots, crown gall, root rots, galls on the roots, leaf curling, wilting, and witch's broom. That's an interesting one up there. It just looks like a spiky growth. A lot of times people don't even know what that is. Even researchers, a lot of times they talk about viruses maybe causing that. But you can see there's just a lot of different places where fungi, disease, or viruses, and bacteria and other diseases can attack a plant. when we look at plants that have problems, most of the time they're not even a biotic thing. It's what we call abiotic, which means it's non-living. And many of those things are things like flooding, or drought, temperature high or low, or a change in that. The site problem isn't right. You've probably already taken a soil test, and you know that if that isn't right, then plants can show problems. Nutritional deficiencies, high excessive fertilizer, pH isn't right, or maybe an improper application of pesticides. All these things can actually make a segue into fungi and bacteria entering the plant. And then we talk about, well, abiotic problems can be kind of shown in a diagram, and I like to have this visual diagram in my mind when I think about these things. When I think about abiotics, I figure up there's a plant, and then there's the environment, and those two together can cause all the problems I talked about on the previous slide: wind, rain, hail, pH, temperature. But then if we get into a third thing, which could be either pathogens or insects, we discussed something that I learned back in graduate school about the disease triangle. And that's basically the plant, the environment, and the pathogen. You put them all together, and if the pathogen or the environment isn't quite right, then you'll have something called disease. And I like to look at this too in my own mind, because that disease right now is a big red blob. And if I can do something to make that red either decrease, maybe go away, but maybe that's not the goal in a lot of cases. A lot of times you just like to make it a lot smaller. Anyway, how would you do that? One is you could just take out the plant or not grow that plant, and then that red would definitely go away. You could maybe pick a disease-resistant plant, and that would make that smaller. You could go to the environment circle and maybe reduce the wetness, because fungi like a lot of wetness. You could do some things with the environment, maybe prune properly to make the plants have more air and sunlight get to the leaves to reduce that disease. Or the pathogens, we could either spray, that's one possibility, or we could find a disease-resistant rose, and that would make that pathogen a lot less. So what I like to use is the disease triangle to quickly, in my mind, think of ways I might be able to reduce the severity of the disease. And then instead of abiotic, now we're talking about biotic. These are the living pathogens. And we'll talk about these more or less as we go along in this talk. There's nematodes, which are those little microscopic worms. There's fungi, which is primarily the biggest group that we talk about. Bacteria is definitely there. And they get smaller and smaller as we go down this list. The nematodes are barely can see. They're about as big as your eyelash. The fungi, sometimes you can see big fungi, but most of the time they're pretty small, little spores. The bacteria might be 100 times smaller than the fungi, and then the viruses are microscopic. They're very, very small, very hard to see, maybe with specialized electron microscopes in certain labs. Here's some fungi, fungal pathogens, and we try to differentiate between things that the plant is reacting to. In other words, the plant might be wilting or that sort of thing, and that's basically a symptom. We don't know why that plant is wilting, but if we can actually see a pathogen that's visible, then we call that a sign. And here we're seeing spores, we're seeing threads, and we're seeing galls, and we're just seeing a lot of things that are actually the fungus in this case. So the signs of the plant disease are often only seen microscopically, not all the time, but the structures like the spores or those fungal threads, we call them mycelia, or mushrooms. Mushrooms are bigger. Bacteria ooze is very small, but sometimes we can cut cut a plant stem or a leaf and actually see all the bacteria just oozing out of that. And sometimes it's sticky. Sometimes we can do a little test to touch it and make it look like a little sticky thread. Virus particles are very, very small. So again, we need the very small or very high-powered microscope. And nematodes usually need a microscope, but sometimes when there's a bunch of them or a lot of them, we can see them under our own eyes. Let's take a look at nematodes real quick. I'm not going to get into it a lot, but it's nice to know what nematodes are because there's probably a researcher at every big university, maybe one or two in some cases, that spend their whole entire career just studying nematodes on certain crops like soybeans, like wheat. So there's some major nematodes that occur. Tomatoes, for instance, can get this nematode called the root knot nematode. And it's about the size of a human hair. There's a human hair. So it's very small. And it has a little worm-like structure. It can get inside the roots. And the roots, while it's inside the roots, it'll cause the roots to have these knots. This is the healthy root. And then in this case, there's another form. Instead of being a worm-like structure, it has sort of a fat female form. And that inside there, if you can kind of see it, you see the egg masses, and then you can actually see the egg masses will be around probably inside of there. And then the eggs will crack open, and then they'll become the worm-like structures that'll go into the leaf. So this is kind of a specialized one called root knot nematode. Now the fungi. The fungi are thousands of different fungal pathogens that occur on every plant, like I said. Sometimes they'll just start growing on there, almost like bread mold. In this case, it's on a turf grass. If we looked at it under the microscope, we could maybe see those threads, and then we might see some spore structures. And if the spore structures get caught in the wind, they might blow off into far away and go somewhere else. Let me get that back. Oh, let me see if I can go back to that one. Yeah, I want to touch this one. And so in the lab, when I was working in the lab, sometimes I would take a few of those spores or maybe a few of those threads, and I'd put them on this potato dextrose, potato sugar agar, and I'd grow it out. And then when I grew it out, I'd maybe take a little piece of this one and a little piece of this one or this one. And they looked a little different on the plate. So I wanted to see which one exactly were causing this problem. So I'd take a little chunk of this and maybe put it on a little bit of grass in a greenhouse, little tub of grass, and I'd try to figure out what was causing that problem. In this case, under the microscope, we see these really big, well, they look pretty big right now, but they're actually very microscopic. But under the microscope, you can see that there's so many of them that they might be even cracking the root. This is inside of a root. This is a root fungus. And so on a microscopic level, they could actually be physically breaking that root open. And also a lot of times these spores will ooze a toxin that actually kills that can kill the plant as well. In this case, we're seeing mushrooms. Some people call these toadstools, but they're a fungus that actually probably grew because this is a new, maybe an office building, and right here there probably was a stump, and someone probably ground that stump to the ground or just cut it, and over time the fungus kept growing. A lot of times in the spring, like it is pretty much right now with all the wetness, we may not see a complete ring like this one is. We might just see a little arc out here, and that'll give you the impression that, yeah, that those threads are growing through the grass, and then out here is the fruiting structure. And underneath every one of these are spores. We call this fairy rings, and there's a good reason why. Back in the day of the Irish, actually, there was mysticism. They didn't know where these things were coming from. And maybe they thought that Irish fairies were meeting here at night and drumming up a lot of their um, no good actions, to try to they'd be fearful of those. So here you can see the mushrooms underneath, and inside each one of these little spaces here are lots of spores that can go off into other places. And then just think about those inside of a tree. Here we see a tree that have these fungal conks, we call them CONKS. Basically, you can see the same thing. Could be spores that spew out of here and can go into something else. But they're going inside the tree too. This is the fruiting structure on the outside of the tree, but inside the tree there could be threads that are killing that tree and causing it to have trunk rot. So they could enter, a lot of times it can enter through wounds that are not always necessary. Pruning cuts, I'll show you what's a good way to make pruning cuts. So it can get into the heartwood, and it could eventually mess up the structural integrity of the tree. A lot of times it's hard to figure out if a tree is in bad shape, even if you see a few of these on there. You can't just scrape these off and expect the tree to recover. It's even hard to do any kind of treatment on trees like this. Occasionally you can cut it out and cut into the tree a little bit, but that's a specialized service that some arborists, some tree experts would do, and it's not generally done. Many times we'll see little blotches on leaves, and these are roses with a leaf spot. If you ever grown roses, you've seen spots on roses. They're very difficult to control. In the recent times, in the last 20 years, there's been roses called knockout roses, and these don't get this disease as much. Sometimes they're pretty resistant, or at least pretty tolerant. But this disease, even though there's a spot or two on there, and that you can see real closely, there's little structures in there. You can call them pimples or little spore bodies. But generally, wherever there's yellow, there's probably those threads that are going inside of the leaf. And eventually, if there's enough of those spots, then it'll cause yellowing and leaf drop. Here's red-tip Photinia is especially susceptible to a fungal problem. And so far as I know, there hasn't been any cultivars of Photinia that proved to be resistant or tolerant of this disease, not like roses. So people still plant Photinia, red-tip Photinia. 20, 30 years ago, everyone had them in their yard. But over the years, this disease has gotten worse and worse, and you can see here the spots get so bad that the leaves start dropping. The next thing you know, you just don't have a very lush and nice-looking plant. Here's what it is. It starts out as these purple blotches and turns to these holes and takes it down. Here's probably the most prevalent problem on our fescue grasses, and that's called brown patch of tall fescue. At first you'll just see what they call a smoke ring in your grass, which will just be actually these threads right here are just growing all over the top of the grass. And then maybe after a week or so, you'll see little blotches, little rings on your lawn, little patches. That's why they call it brown patch. If you took it to the lab or look at real closely to the leaf blades, you'd see blades that have a kind of a straw colored blotch, not a spot, just a blotch, and little darker brown going around it. So that's one diagnostics that most me and master gardeners or whatever could figure it out from. If we send it to the lab, they might look at it on this level, and they would see that this one has a right-angled thread. Here's this one, and then it comes out here. then this one just has a cross wall. So there's different ways to identify. Here's a pretty nasty problem on Volutella or on boxwood, and it's called Volutella canker. Now, if you've been keeping up on boxwood, you know there's a boxwood blight out there too. And boxwood blight has more of a whitish. If you look at this, it's more of a yellow spore looking just material, fungal material on the bottom of the leaves. If it was boxwood blight, it would have more of a whitish color. And there's actually another disease. I think this one's called macrophoma or phomopsis, different Latin names that they give to these things. But you or I can look at these and maybe take a picture of this and send it into the distance diagnostics that I showed before, and you could probably get a pretty good diagnosis on what it could be. Again, if you had to send it to the lab would look at it underneath the microscope and take a picture there and see what it is. Every one of us are going to grow probably little starts, little petunias, things like that, put in our flower gardens this year. One of the diseases that can get into the garden as the year goes on is botrytis. And botrytis can get on a lot of different problems. It has a little round spore. You've probably seen this in your garden. Usually you'll see it when the plants are real tight together and they're growing real good, and you get a lot of rain and humidity, and you'll see it on a lot of different things. Here's another disease where I'm going to go through several of them. One of the common plants that we have, iris, gets a leaf spot. And if you look real close, you can see that inside has all these spore bodies. These are the fruiting structures. And then just imagine that it's not only going after the brown, but it's going through all between the leaf tissue too. So we'll get into, well, we won't get into really how to control this. I'll just say that if you can identify the problem first, then you can look it up and look into bulletins, and then you could make some effort to see what's the best way to control a certain disease. Here's one on pine trees. Sometimes the fungus gets right into actually the cone, and then during every disease has a life cycle. In this case, it can get on the needles, and then it can get on the cones, and it might even overwinter on the cones. And then in the spring, during wetness periods, the spores get wet, and sometimes they expand. Sometimes they actually shoot in the air. Often they just come out of the structure, and then the wind blows them to another spot. Here's one that occurs very commonly. It just looks like someone put some powder on leaves, like some baby powder. But really what it is a fungus. And the fungus is basically a topical fungus. It doesn't go too deep into the plant. It's not considered as devastating as a lot of fungi that I'll be showing. But it can get on a lot of plants. Here I show that it can get on crabapple, dogwood, oak, poplar, sycamore, many hosts. But the interesting thing here is that these are all separate powdery mildews. If you have a lot of dogwoods, for instance, in your property, and someone next door has crabapples, and dogwoods are looking good, and they've got powdery mildew on their crabapples, their powdery mildew is not going to float over and get on yours. They're very separate. Diseases aren't always that way, but I'm just telling you that powdery mildew is that way. They're very separate. And the nice thing about powdery mildews is that over the years, there become lots of resistant cultivars. For instance, a lot of work has been put into dogwood. There's a lot of resistant powdery mildew dogwood, either tolerant or resistant. There's quite a few crepe myrtles now that are highly tolerant of powdery mildew. Powdery mildew wasn't even known on poinsettia, 30 years ago. That was sort of a new disease that popped up. Where did it come from? Who knows? A lot of times we blame a foreign country. It might come in on material that is shared between nurseries, or plants come in from all over the world these days. So who knows where they come from? It's hard. Sometimes they can do DNA tracking, fingerprinting to tell us where they came from. But now that we have them, we have to deal with them. I always point out that the spores can be pretty interesting, almost artistic in a way. Here's a disease called anthracnose, which also occurs on different plants. And each different plant gets a different anthracnose. So dogwood anthracnose in the middle there is a very, actually that one is a very devastating disease in dogwoods. Sycamore, not as death defying or death threatening. Oak, the same way. Sometimes those trees get the disease early in the spring, and then they come bouncing back in pretty late spring. But dogwood anthracnose, at least the one that's the serious one, can devastate the dogwood and get into the wood, and then get into the tree, and eventually kill the tree. Here's some more anthracnose diseases. Strawberries, very big. It's a big problem in strawberries. Tomatoes can get it usually at the end of the year. Corn, beans, cucumbers. And to get rid of most of these, we can use fungicides, but a lot of research is going into coming up with the anthracnose resistant varieties. Black rot of grape is a fungal disease. You can see that the little tiny bumps are just full of spores. If we could take a little bit of that and put it on the microscope, each one of those little bumps, you'd probably see thousands of spores. And that's what can happen if you leave your grapes full of these over winter. They shrink, and then we call them mummies. They'll just shrink into raisins, basically sitting on the tree or on the grapevine, and then the water will hit them. The wetness in the spring will hit them, and they'll blow in the wind and get on new developing grapes. So it's wise to prune your grapes every winter to not only get them thinned out, because you don't need to have all those vines to produce good grapes, but also to get out all the bad tissue that might have had the fungus on there. We all know about daylilies, and daylilies are beautiful plants, and they were pretty well problem-free. Everyone thought so up until the year 2000. And it's been 20 years now, so that's quite a while ago. But anyway, there was a disease that came through called daylily rust. It was a fungal disease. Not quite sure where it came from, but you can see down below here, it looks like a rusty old car, and it has lots of spores that can blow in the wind and be carried. Basically, what happened is it was carried on material in garden centers and transported everywhere. And in 1 year's time, it expanded into virtually every state in the union that had daylilies. There's such a interstate commerce of daylilies that they didn't know what was going on, and it really spread pretty quickly. And that's what I'm getting at here: movement of plant pathogens. They can move by air currents, water. Insects can carry them. We can carry things through our equipment. If a harvester is going through, or a planter, sometimes that can be a problem. Maybe we can move plant or pathogens around with hoses, and maybe even humans can carry, on their clothes, or move, like I said, with daylilies. They might have shared plants with different people and move the plant pathogens around. You've probably seen trees that are not looking too good. They might even have a canker on the trees. So the canker it can be the result of a mechanical, let's say a hailstone hit that, or someone bumped that with a string trimmer, or bumped it in with a garden tractor or whatever. But once there's an injury, well, actually, they don't even need an injury. The spore, if the host is susceptible, and the conditions are right, remember the disease triangle, then the fungus can get inside the tree and cause a little canker. And also you can see, in this case, all the little spore bodies on the inside of this canker. A lot of times it's right after a drought, then the plant is susceptible. And also on new trees, they're quite susceptible. And we'll talk about, well, I don't know if we'll talk about it, but many times you can tell if a tree is responding and is resistant. In this case, I don't think either one of these are very resistant. If it was resistant, there'd be a big fat ring of callus going all the way around the tree. Sometimes you can stimulate a tree, maybe by fertilizing it properly or just encouraging good health, that you'll get that callus. Again, here's one that's very susceptible. Leland cypress gets this canker called Ceridium canker. There's 2 or 3 other fungi. This is the name of the fungus. But you can see what we're up against. There's probably thousands of these little bumps on these branches. And inside of each one of these bumps, this is just full of spores, probably 1,000 spores, kind of going up in sort of a screw type or a spring looking thing. And just thousands of spores just waiting to be blown in the wind. And in this case, probably splashed by water. A lot of people think, well, that's just probably drought. So we'll water the trees extra heavy and we'll put on overhead irrigation to make it even just cool the plant down. But what they're actually doing is increasing the fungus. And this fungus is not just a leaf fungus, but it goes into the woody tissue of the tree. And unfortunately, there isn't really any fungicides or any treatment that you can do to remove that from the tree. So we tell people not to plant Leland cypress because it could be a tree that will give you maybe 10 or 15 years of pretty good growth, but then later it'll be stressed like we get every year. And we see a lot of places in subdivisions where this tree lasts for about 10 or 15 years, and then it succumbs to this problem. So maybe an alternative to Leland cypress might be this green giant arborvitae. These have been pretty good replacements. They do get mites and bagworms, but at least they're more or less alive. We can treat the bagworms and the mites pretty easily. And here's a one big long name. Again, it's a Latin name for this canker. And probably this was a bad pruning mark with this red bud. Someone got in here and maybe left a big stub on their tree. And the next thing you know, that fungus got in the stub and went right into the tree. That's why I have this comical slide where trees and plants always look like the people they live with somehow. I have to admit that I've got a few trees that look pretty terrible because I don't prune them quite properly. And you might have already had a pruning seminar, but you want to make the pruning cuts just right. You don't want to leave a big stub because then the fungus gets on that stub and it gets into your tree. And sometimes, in this case, the U.S. Arboretum, there's a lot of scientific universities and businesses that are looking for things that are resistant. In this case, they were looking for a red bud, probably not for disease resistance so much, but they were trying to get a nice, pretty blooming red bud with very little fruit, because that could be a problem with so many seeds landing on the ground and starting new red buds. But they also found one that was this Botryosphaeria tolerant, which was a pretty cool find for that. And I'm starting to see this one out in the public. Going back in history, we know, or maybe we've heard of, things like chestnut blight, which is a fungal canker, and it just about wiped out all the chestnuts in the American forest. There's been some found in, actually, if you watch my pointer, over in the Chicago area. There's actually a forest over there that hasn't gotten it yet, at least, and they have these magnificent chestnuts. I'd love to go up there and visit it. I'm from Michigan and I've never gone over there. I'd just love to go and visit and see and just scratch my head and see why they haven't got it yet. But you can see maybe it's because it's outside of the primary range. This fungus has gone through the whole range pretty much of the primary oak trees. And so you can see it gets into the tree itself and causes these terrible cankers and just a terrible disease. 1904. Another disease of past is in about 1930 in Ohio, over and throughout everywhere where there's American elm that are grown. You can see how beautiful they were back in the day. They were a great street tree and great for shade. But over a period of time, over 40 million trees have been killed worldwide. And maybe that's a really small estimate. $2,500 a tree probably wouldn't even take the tree out. And we'll talk about this too later. But right now, well, I'll mention it right now. It's vectored by an elm beetle that scratches on the limb or scratches on the leaves and the twigs. And the next thing you know, over here, you see there's a dead branch or a dead limb. And over a period of time, that fungus gets inside the wood of the tree and just goes right up the vascular system of the tree. It clogs up the vascular system, and the next thing you know, water can't get up through the tree. There has been some work on finding some resistant elms. This one's called Frontier. It's a good tree, zones 5 to 8. It's tolerant of urban conditions and highly tolerant to Dutch elm disease. There's several. There's one called Liberty that I'm aware of. So it's worthwhile. I understand that they're not meant to get really huge like the American elm, but they're a nice tree for ornamental value and just to say you have a nice elm tree. It gives you another palette of trees in your yard. Now let's go to maybe right now in the spring where you're trying to start your own seeds. If you start your own seeds, in the old days, you would just get some garden soil, put the seeds in the ground, and maybe you'd get quite a few that grew, but a lot of times you'd get ones that just keeled over. And that's because there's fungi, all kinds of things in soil. And if the soil is too wet, it can cause those diseases to damp off. Damp means wet. And so the disease just gets on the lower part of the stem or the roots and kills it that way. In this era of modern technology, whatever, we can go to the garden center and get some really nice potting soil. And generally that potting soil is not sterilized, it's pasteurized. And so it's got very, very few pathogens inside that soil. So use that kind of soil to start your seeds and to get them growing real good, and then you can transplant. Often these diseases are much less once the seeds are out of the ground and have a nice waxy coat on their stem or leaves. In this case, though, Japanese hollies can still be very susceptible to root rot. For some reason they just don't like wet feet. Wet feet is a term we use for plants that just don't like to be too wet of the soil. The soil is too wet. And so if you're going to buy these from a nursery, I would pull them out of the pot maybe and look and see if there's some rot starting. You want to see some nice white roots when you buy something. You might see one or two of these, but here we're seeing quite a bit of this rotted. You don't want to bring it into your yard because then if it's a wet condition, that'll just keep on going and turn all these other ones black. So here's an very interesting fungal disease. You might see it in the spring right now. If you noticed in the wintertime, if you've got cedars, and it can be on some other trees too, I'll talk about it. But this is a fungus that can go on two hosts. In this case, it spends part of its time on cedar, and then part of the year it spends on apple. Of course, we have apple orchards that they don't really want this disease on their leaves, and it can get on fruit too. So if they've got cedar trees around their orchard or nearby, this is what they might see. They'll see this little hard, crusty ball, and a lot of people will think, oh, that's just the fruit. No, that's actually the fruiting structure of the fungus. And here's what it looks like on a nice wet spring. It explodes open and turns into these spore horns. That's what they call it. And on each one of these horns is just covered with spores that just go blow in the wind. Then they go over to the apple and start all these infections. So how do you control it? You might have to cut these out if you can, as many as you can. You might, if you're an orchard person, you'd want to cut all the cedars maybe a mile away if you could from your orchard. If they do get on apples, you could spray some chemicals that would keep that off. You might even find some apple cultivars that are resistant to apples. Here's that life cycle. In the spring, they come out, they blow in the wind to the apple. And like I said, it gets on the fruit as well. Then the fall again, the spores blow over and get back on the cedar tree. Here's another interesting gall. Usually in wet years, you'll see this. You won't see these all the time, and they look pretty grotesque, but by and large, they're not as bad as they look. You'll see this on azaleas. There was a time, let's say, I don't know, when I was working in Nashville, the governor of Michigan lived about a block away from the clinic. So we went over there and we saw 4 gardeners just picking these off like they were picking blueberries and putting them in buckets. And that was a pretty good control measure just to get rid of it, because inside of every one of these galls are just thousands of spores. On a dry year, they wouldn't even have come out. You'll see it on camellia. Again, they don't go back and forth. You'll see it on peach, plum. This one is right in the leaf. I've seen all these before. And in one year you'll see them, and in a dry year you won't. Here's one you see in plums and cherries, the stone fruit. And it's just a big knot on the branch. It looks like a nondescript knot. Sometimes it can get pretty bad. And inside, if you looked at this with a hand lens, you could barely see tiny little holes, little pores, maybe 1,000 pores in that one little knot. And in each one of those little pores are probably, 1,000 spores that can ooze out and just blow in the wind. So what you'd like to do, if you could catch it early, is to prune it out if it's in a small branch. And sometimes the pruning that you do on your fruit trees, it can lead to more of this because the fungus can actually get into it. So you want to prune during the winter when the branches aren't susceptible to this fungus that's flying around. Here's an interesting one called corn smut. And I always tell people, do not Google this term. You'll get a lot of other websites. But basically, when it's white, you might have seen this on sweet corn. When it's white, you can actually eat it. It's a delicacy in some of the Mexican countries, Hispanic countries. But for us, it's just a fungus that can cause a problem on the ears of the corn. I think you can get on the tassels as well. Just another example of fungus. Now let's move to bacteria. We talked about fungi. Now let's just talk about bacteria, which are somewhat fewer problems. Maybe it's because we just haven't discovered all the bacteria that can occur on plants. Here's one that we see quite a bit. It's on Bradford pear. And we'll call these, one of the terms they use is strikes. You can see it almost looks like there was a lightning strike, but what it was is a bacteria got in there little place. And often they get in there from an insect that carried it there. Bacteria need something to get them inside of the plant. So in this case, there's apple, pear, hawthorn, spread by pollinators. So in this case, often it's honeybees that go from plant to plant. in fruit trees, that an apple, it can occur that way. The shoots die rapidly, and the damage can be severe. Some years it's going to be bad when it's wet and humid. Other years it's not going to be too bad. One of the characteristics is what they call a shepherd's crook, or a shepherd's staff. And how do you manage it? You manage by pruning these out in the wintertime. It's not wise to prune them during the spring because your clippers could just spread the bacteria. The bacteria get inside, or start out in the flower and get into the leaf and get into the stem and can go all the way to the wood. But it goes pretty slow once it gets into the wood, unless it's very susceptible. But then pruning, there are antibiotic sprays they could use, and some people would use those. They're available, but a lot of times you don't need to, as a homeowner, to get into the antibiotic sprays. Here's a leaf spot that can occur on English ivy. There's actually a fungal spot. It can look almost the same as this bacterial spot. And the difference would be the fungal spot would have little pimples on the inside. You'd see little dots. Maybe that's a fungal spot. Whereas the bacterial leaf spot would be just bacteria in there. And what you can do if you had a microscope is you could make a cut right down the center, look at it under the microscope in some water, and maybe you'd see some oozing, the bacteria just coming out, and you'd see little tiny bacteria. Just, you wouldn't see one, but you'd see 1,000 of them all together. It says here bacterial sprays are generally ineffective, and that's true. Here's a bacterial disease that can get on fruit trees. Fruit trees, we call this crown gall, because this is about where the crown of the plant is on a fruit tree. And it's these big bumps. In the old days, early researchers thought they were very similar to cancer, because what happens is the bacteria lands on the tissue, and then the tissue goes crazy. It just develops, reproduces into this mass of unorganized tissue. And there's not much you can do about it. Sometimes what fruit growers do is they dip their roots into a bacteria that's sort of a kissing cousin of crown gall, only it's a good crown gall. For better, it's the same type of organism, only it doesn't infect. What it does, it just lays on the outside of the crown, and then when the pathogen comes along, it protects it because it can't get inside. They call it cross protection. This one always looks to me like an insect did this, shoot a hole in it, but really what it is it's a bacterial leaf spot. They call it shot hole, as if someone shot a gun. But it's very common in cherry laurel and cherry ornamental cherries, or even production cherries get it quite a bit. Another one that we don't see much around here in Chattanooga, at least I haven't seen it, is bacterial leaf scorch. It's terrible up in Nashville when I used to live up there. I understand it's really bad in Kentucky as well. There's a little insect called a leaf hopper. Leaf hoppers are those insects that you'll see when you see them on a stem or a plant. They move sideways, they walk sideways. So not every leaf hopper has the disease, but if they do, they can scratch on the leaves, and the next thing you know, the bacteria gets inside the leaf. Next thing you know, it goes from the leaf into the stem, into the branch, into the vascular tissue, almost like Dutch elm disease. And within about 4 years, that tree can die. And then viruses. Viruses are very, very small. We can't really diagnostically look at them very easily with our microscopes, so we have to rely on symptoms. We know a lot about viruses from research. We know that often they're spread, not always, but often spread with insects. An insect, in this case, here's an aphid that sucks up some juices from a plant, and there might have been viruses in that plant. So it can either just suck them up and then shoot them back into another plant. Sometimes it puts them in their gut, and where they incubate, and the virus gets more populated, and then it goes and injects it in some other plant. So it's a very fascinating research that goes into this. Control measures are difficult. A lot of times you've got to control the insect to control the virus. Here's some pictures of viruses. Sometimes the viruses, because they're basically part of an RNA or a DNA of the plant, it can mess up with the coloring of the plant. It can mess up the growth of the plant. A lot of times the color of the skin on that cucumber looks terrible. So now let's finish up with control. Some of the control types. There's biological control, there's cultural control, chemical control. The resistance would be when you could find plants that are basically resistant. There's lots of work. This is sort of a primary way of trying to get around diseases and insects as well. You try to find a plant that's tolerant or resistant. That way you don't rely so much on chemicals. Here's here's some ways of biological control. We talked about disease resistant through breeding. There's antagonistic organisms like the competition and cross protection of the crown gall. Sometimes there's certain fungi that researchers find that can parasitize some of the other fungi, the good fungi against the bad fungi again. And then there's biological products or extracts. You've probably seen these at garden centers. There's cinnamon oil, there's neem oil, there's just kind of a lot of products on the market. Here's a catalog, a very popular seed catalog, and they have, if you look inside the catalog, often you'll see that certain varieties of tomatoes in this instance are resistant or tolerant to these different problems that can occur. And over the years, researchers have not only looked to the taste and the growth of different plants, but they also try to rate the disease that's going on with that plant. And then they can tell you what they found at the research station maybe, and I'm not sure where they did their research here. Usually every university has some kind of research going on with flowers or vegetables or trees or something. And then cultural control, we emphasize this all the time because this is kind of like just protecting your own space. Disinfect tools, clean pots and benches, use good soil, clean water, remove diseased plants promptly. And then remove bad plant parts. Maybe you can keep that plant, but just get rid of the dead, every so often go out and cut out all the dead leaves. Some other cultural activities you can use. There's buy seed from a reputable source. If you're going to buy seeds to start, make sure you get them from some place that has done a seed test. Avoid pathogens. Inspect plants prior to purchase. That's where I said pull the plants out of the pot if you can. Look the other way and see if the garden manager is not looking, but I kid that way. But yeah, just look them over, look underneath the leaves to see if there's any mites or aphids. You don't want to start out with a bad problem with diseases or insects. If you've got two different things, for instance, if you're trying to grow apples and you've got a lot of cedar, you're going to either spray or, so in this case, you want to control an alternate host and then keep hoses up off the ground, because a lot of times bacteria can be harbored in that hose that's left on the ground. Here's some other good ideas. When you're planting or spacing your plants, make sure you space them far enough so you can get good air circulation. If you see a diseased plant, remove it. Avoid late afternoon and nighttime irrigation, because if you water in the afternoon, going into the nighttime, your plants stay wet. So you want to minimize that leaf wetness by watering either only on potentially sunny days, so water in the morning, and they should dry out by mid-afternoon, early evening. Rotate plant families. What that means is, for instance, tomato and potato, eggplant are all in the same family. Cucumber, watermelon, they're all in the same family. Pickles. And so if you rotate from family to family in your garden, or even in the different spots in your garden, chances are you're going to get less disease because there's not as much as those spores laying in the soil ready to attack that new plant. So if you're going to propagate plants, you're going to take cuttings of things. Make sure you do it from clean material. And clean your containers with bleach and water solution. There's other products on the market that can be used to clean. It's not as toxic or as overwhelming as bleach. There's some very good products that you could use for cleaning pots, or just use clean or new containers. If you're in the business, use new containers. And a lot of times insect control is important, because insects can hop from place to place and carry a few spores on their body and cause that disease to spread around. Some folks get into even monitoring the equipment. They can get some wetness meters in their garden. They can get a wind meter. A farmer would do this, but sometimes homeowners are curious on how they can predict if a problem is going to occur in their they do modeling actually for figuring out diseases. You don't want to go out in your garden when it's wet, because you could just be moving things around. If you're going to harvest things, wait till the day is kind of dried off before you get your feet in there in the garden, or if you're starting to move things around. Orientation of rows. Some people say north and south. That way, if the sun comes around, it dries things out quicker. But it's a little complicated if you've got it on a slope. Sometimes you have to make it so that you're going to keep the soil erosion, or try to have maximum sun to dry things out. Density of planting. Surely you can reduce the number of plants just to make it so there's more airflow and more sunlight hitting the plants. And the type of irrigation. You want to make sure you try to irrigate, if at all possible, the roots on the ground, and reduce the amount of water that gets on the leaves in general. Occasionally you'd want to, or you could, spritz the plants on top if it's if it's hot outside, and the recommendations are to cool the plants off in the afternoon. As long as the leaves get dried out by evening, then you're pretty good. Or staking and trellising often can lift the plant up off the ground so that you don't get the splashing. Often diseases start from the soil when the rain splashes the soil and the spores jump up and get on the first bottom leaves, and then they keep on going up. So if you can stake up the plants or be on a trellis, that's a big way of doing it. Now we saved, or I specifically saved chemical control till the end, because it's something we should think at the very last, but we shouldn't forget it. We've shown through lots of studies that chemical control can be a very good tactic tool in your arsenal. Protective fungicides are what we mostly use, because it's basically putting a layer of chemical on the outside of a plant to just keep the spores from landing on there and taking hold. Although there's been a lot of research in the past 20 years on systemic fungicides in this case, where you spray it around the plant, or even spray it on the leaves or in the soil, and the chemical goes into the leaf and goes from one side of the leaf to the other side of the leaf. It may go from the leaf down into the roots. So there's more of those with insecticides, but there are some with plant diseases. But most of us homeowners are going to be using protective fungicides. And fumigants are more used by professional growers or commercial growers. Now, if you're thinking of organic, be aware that organic controls are not less or not more safe. In general, they're natural products, and they tend to be on the safer side. But sometimes overspraying these things can, for instance, too much copper building up in the soil if you're spraying so many times with copper. Lime, hydrogen peroxide is something that could be used to clean pots. And let's see, oils. Oils are really good. Oils can be very good for insects because oils basically drown the insects or suffocate the insects. Sometimes they get on the leaf surface, and they can actually keep spores from germinating as well. Let's see, sulfur, and then I talked about streptomycin and terramycin. The reason I would let professional growers use these more than homeowners, there's this issue of we use some of these things for our own bacterial problems. And if we're using them too much in the garden, there's a theory that maybe we're reducing our ability to get result from using those kind of bactericides. And then there's products out there that have some benefit. They're on the market. They could be used to just tip the balance in the favor of, especially for a homeowner. Might be hard to spray baking soda on a 20-acre field, but for a small garden, it's shown to maybe do some good in a rose bush or a small area, especially, and the same thing for using chili and mustard oil for nematodes, hydrogen peroxide for leaf diseases, and mint oil for other fungal diseases. You'll see these products on progressive garden centers. And that's the disease part of my talk today. I've got another video that I'm going to stop this one right here, and I'm going to give you a little taste, but I'll do the guide to insects and mite pests in another video that you should seek out and search. I'll be putting these on YouTube. So until then, I'll say goodbye and thank you for watching today. Thank you.